sorry.
Also a quote there from the new chair of the Public Accounts Committee, Sean Fleming, who describes it as outrageous, and he is going to have an investigation at the PSC there. Now, to discuss some of the stories in the papers, we're joined by the Minister for Health, Simon Harris, Labour Senator Ivan Bacik, and Mark Hennessy, the news editor of the Irish Times. You're all very welcome, and good morning to you. Simon Harris, if I could turn to you first. You spoke on this bill, Mick Wallace's bill, on Thursday.
Yes.
In the Dáil. Ordinarily, as Minister for Health, you'd be speaking for the government, but that doesn't seem to be the case here, because we have some dissenters there who say they're not going to vote with the government on this.
Well, I think the first point I'd make is that the conversation hasn't concluded at Cabinet, and I suppose if ever there was an issue that you were going to give extra time and extra space to discuss sensitively and have an informed discussion, it should be around issues relating to abortion, and issues relating specifically, in the case of this bill, to fatal fetal abnormalities. This is a hugely sensitive issue. It's an issue that's divided Irish society for years, and it's divided families. It's an issue that lots of different people...
you have legal advice from the Attorney General.
Yeah, I mean, the way it worked, I suppose, is, and you know, this is the way it generally works. A minister receives a private member's bill. The minister would consult the Attorney General of the day and seek views on the legality and constitutionality of the bill. And I was given very clear advice, as was the Cabinet, from the Attorney General, that this bill does not work in relation to the Constitution. And I found myself on the floor of the Dáil last Thursday agreeing with the spirit of what the bill wanted to achieve, but basically feeling duty bound to outline how I didn't believe this bill could do what it wanted to do without a referendum. So I also did something, and I'm not sure it was noticed by many, but I did read in full into the record of the Dáil all of the advice made available to me, both from the Attorney General and from the Chief Medical Officer. So I gave 5 reasons why we weren't in a position to support the bill: 2 legal, 2 medical, and 1 obviously being the fact that we do have a process in place now in terms of the Citizens' Assembly to look at these issues.
Quite obviously, Shane Ross and Finian McGrath, despite receiving that advice and saying that they accept the validity of the advice, they say they will not vote with the government despite being in the Cabinet.
Well, look, I think there has been no final decision reached in relation to this. We'll resume the discussion at the Cabinet meeting on Tuesday, and there'll be a vote in the Dáil on Thursday. It is true to say that there isn't a unanimity in terms of a viewpoint on this. But you know what? That's not necessarily a bad thing. People have different views on this. What we need to do as a Cabinet is balance the two competing priorities: the rights that everybody has to have strong personally held views, and the obligations that you have when you're part of a collective decision-making body like the Cabinet. And it's that balance that we need to try and get right this week.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't that the crux of it? It's not the substance of the bill, because it seems that those who are not going along with the Cabinet accept the legal advice in that regard, but it seems to be the principle that they believe they're entitled to a free vote. And the other issue there, of course, is how the Taoiseach has handled the matter in front of the whole Cabinet, rather than perhaps meeting them privately to go through the issue. There's been suggestions in one of the papers that some Fine Gael sources are questioning how well Mr Kenny has handled the matter.
No, I thought the Taoiseach's handled it very well, and when it became obvious that there wasn't going to be an immediate kind of decision on the issue, the Taoiseach adjourned the discussion to allow further opportunity for discussion. I've had a number of conversations with independent ministers. I've also made available to colleagues a number of medical experts, including masters of maternity hospitals, who can discuss the practical implications of this bill, which might be of use to colleagues, and I'd encourage colleagues to avail of that opportunity. And we'll reach a decision. But it is important to say, not to be pedantic about language, but we have not yet reached a decision as a Cabinet. I mean, the week before, and I don't like comparing these issues at all, but I mean, the week before, the Cabinet took a decision in relation to hair coursing, where different people had different views. So you know, we will make a decision. I believe a resolution will be found in time for the vote on Thursday. And you know, contrary to what I read in some of the papers, there is no sense of panic or crisis. There's just very different views held, and we will work our way through it, and it's appropriate we work our way through it in a respectful manner.
Mark Hennessy, this doesn't bode well for the new government.
No, I mean, the practicalities of it don't make a great deal of sense. As you say, they appear to accept the constitutional advice. So at one level, what this is merely playing to the gallery in search of cheap headlines. And having said that, you know, there is an argument for all matters to deal with abortion to be simply on a free vote. We've been here before. We had Lucinda some years ago.
Even within the Cabinet?
Well, you know, if we're not going to maintain, have any sort of coherent positions, there is an argument behind having a free vote. I think what they've done on this particular occasion is politically foolish, because they're raising the bar for themselves on issues that will create real political difficulties within Cabinet at a later point, because people will come up to them and say, well, you did X on abortion, why don't you do the same thing now? So from that point of view, it's foolish, particularly when they themselves appear to accept that the legislation legislation as put forward doesn't make any, is not constitutional.
There's a suggestion that Enda Kenny is being too overly strict on the whole matter. I mean, is it necessary to push a collective cabinet approach? And for example, go back to the 70s, even Liam Cosgrave from recollection, he voted
against his own legislation. And that's my point, that you could have started off with a premise that all of these matters are down to free vote and you just let the ball play where it plays. But when that isn't the situation, there is a need for a collective responsibility, and there is a need for a government to look like a government. Is that a misjudgment on Enda Kenny's part? I think you can certainly argue that. But I think there are two sets of misjudgments going on here. One, to have gone down the road of insisting that it was covered by collective responsibility. But now that we are in that situation, the Independent Alliance, who had meetings yesterday, who delegating their people to continue in the fashion that they're doing, to raise this question about it being an independent alliance in some ways, that is going to cause them more and more serious problems as time goes down, if they look like they're always going to be playing to the gallery. And there is absolutely no doubt that on the basis of what we see at the moment, if you're saying that you legally accept that something can't work, and yet if you insist on supporting it, that doesn't make a great deal of logical sense.
And what about abstaining?
Does it make any difference? You're either part of the team or you're not.
Ivana, are the Labour Party going to play to the gallery in this bill?
Well, the Labour Party have a strong record on the issue of repeal of the 8th Amendment. We stood against the 8th Amendment in 1983, and we have adopted a pro-choice policy. We've put forward the only large party to do this. We've put forward the alternative legislation we would introduce if the 8th Amendment were to be repealed, and we've been working hard to try and achieve a consensus around the need for repeal of the 8th Amendment, because the most important thing about this whole debate is the reality for the many women and indeed men, the couples who face the dreadful tragedy of a fatal fetal abnormality, and who currently under our law must travel to England to terminate pregnancy if they wish to do so.
But in terms of this bill, the most important thing is whether or not it's constitutional and whether it can go through on that basis. And it would seem that the advice from the Attorney General is that it can't, and you're a lawyer yourself, and surely you're aware of that also.
I am, of course. I haven't seen the Attorney General's advice, but I think there are two issues here. The issue of the constitutional issue, I think, is fairly clear, and I would absolutely agree with Mark that I think the Independent Alliance are doing some posturing here, because if they're members of Cabinet, they must sign up to the legal advice of the Attorney General, and that's really the free vote issue is a red herring on that. Either they accept that advice as members of Cabinet or they don't. So I think that's one issue. I think the much bigger issue, however, is the issue about what needs to be done, and clearly, and I think Shane Coleman has a very good piece in the Sunday Independent on this, clearly the issue is a much bigger one. I talked about repeal of the 8th Amendment. I think the best legal view on the issue of fatal fetal abnormality is that even if it is possible, and I think it might be possible to legislate within the terms of the Constitution, but it would be in such a narrow set of circumstances where there was absolutely no prospect of a baby being born alive, if you like, at the end of a pregnancy. It's in such a tiny set of circumstances that I think it wouldn't actually cover the reality for so many couples where they're given a diagnosis that the baby might live for hours or days. So I think the reality is we need to repeal the 8th Amendment and bring in compassionate legislation that allows for abortion on grounds beyond those very narrow, extraordinarily narrow grounds. On that basis, will the Labour Party support the bill, or will they go along with what would appear to be your position? We absolutely support the principle of the need. The bill itself, the principle, will you support this bill, the Labour Party? I would like to see the party supporting the bill, but I think even though the legal advice is that it's... I think the difficulty is it's almost identical, as I understand, to the bill previously introduced by Claire Daly, and I think at that point the advice clearly from the Attorney General that Labour ministers would have then seen, of course, was that bill was unconstitutional. So this bill may not be possible to support, but in principle we absolutely support the need not just to provide for those couples in that dreadful situation, like the very brave group of Termination for Medical Reasons and Amanda Mellett, but we also will be pushing for repeal of the 8th Amendment. Now I think the key thing is it needs to be repealed. I don't believe that there's any merit legally or politically in putting any other wording into the Constitution. For example, just amending the Constitution, the Article 43.3, to provide for certain grounds. So will the Labour Party support this bill? We haven't made a decision on that yet, Mick, and so that decision will be made this week. As I say, I would, in principle, all of us support the need to legislate. I think everybody would. But the bigger issue for us is the need to repeal the 8th Amendment and provide compassionate legislation for the 4,000 women who travel every year to England from Ireland in grounds beyond just fatal fetal.
Can I just say, I mean, one of the disappointing things this week is that the coverage, and understandably so, of the issue has been about the political process. Which way would which politician vote? And I think it's overshadowing what was a really, really powerful debate that we had in the Dáil the other night, Mick. And I mean, I'd encourage people actually to look back at it. I mean, we had a scenario, and this has never happened before. We had a scenario where every single TD who spoke from every side of the House advocated that this situation needs to change. Now, Ivan is right. There will be disagreements and discussion about how you change and how much change you do and how best to put it change. But we heard some very personal, powerful testimonies from Richard Boyd Barrett, from Kate O'Connell, my colleague. As Minister for Health, I was in a position to apologise to Amanda Mellett for the appalling way she was treated, not just in relation to the termination issue, but actually in terms of how our health service interacted.
It was very late coming that apology. Not your brief. No, you weren't there, but it was very late.
Well, we only received the UN views in recent weeks, and I was very eager, regardless of any opinions from officialdom, that I wanted to put on the record of the House my apology in the role that I hold, because when I read the UN views, I mean, I wasn't shocked that Amanda Mellett couldn't access a termination in Ireland for fatal fetal abnormality. We all know that's the situation. But what did genuinely shock me was the grotesque way I believed that she was treated before the termination and after the termination, in terms of the lack of services, supports, the lack of bereavement counselling. And I'm meeting the group that Ivana mentions, terminations for medical reasons, this week. And I've asked my officials and the HSE to look at how we ensure that services we say are available in Ireland are actually made available to women, because that just added further insult to injury and added more pain and more suffering for Miss Mellett. And I'm sure for many, I can't be confident that it's an isolated incident. So,
yeah,
but we had a very, very powerful debate, and the fact that, and a very useful debate and a very respectful debate. And I mean, I came through, as did Ivana, the Protection of Life During Pregnancy bill, an extraordinarily difficult time for politicians, with quite a vicious campaign from both sides at times. And I noticed a change of tone in the Dáil, which I think was really, really good and really important. And it does augur well for having a mature discussion about this.
I must say that I think it was a very strong debate, and I do think that it's a huge change we've seen in this issue, in the fact that people will now be debating openly, and a large part of that is due to very brave individuals like Amanda Mellett and the people in the group of termination for medical reasons. I should say that 4 years ago, quite a number of us, about 20 Labour TDs and senators, wrote to the then Minister for Health, James Riley, asking that he would place the issue of fatal fetal abnormality within the terms of the expert review group that led to the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act. Now, the Minister didn't do so at the time, and again, we understood at the time that was on the basis of legal advice, that the only way one could legislate for fatal fetal abnormality within the terms of the Constitution was so narrow that it would really be impractical to do it. But I mean, I still think it would be possible to do it, but the big but is that doesn't resolve the situation for the vast majority of individuals and couples in crisis pregnancy.
And that unity that currently exists in the Dáil will start to strip away once people start dealing with the details of this. Are we talking about a fetus that can't be born alive, or one that can be born for
Will it strip away, Mark? You think
it's bound to, given the nature of the feelings within the Oireachtas about abortion and the principle of it. It's one thing thinking in terms of a woman who simply cannot bring a birth to its conclusion with a live baby at the end of it. That's one issue. It's a different ball game when somebody accepts that the baby cannot be alive. It's actually relatively easy for somebody to support that.
But won't the referendum have to precede that discussion anyway? The first issue will have to be to repeal the 8th and then decide afterwards.
No, I don't think so. And in fact, this is where I genuinely see huge merit in the Citizens' Assembly, because a lot of people in this country want to see change in this area. To get change, you've got to get 50% plus one person to vote for change. Now, that's always more difficult than it seems, and I've heard a lot of people on different sides of the debate accepting that if you actually held a referendum today, there's no guarantee it would pass. I mean, I remember we were even concerned that the marriage equality referendum would pass. Thank God it did, but about a third of people in this country still voted against it. So there does now need to be a forum where we can have an informed debate about the entire issue, where we can hear from experts, where we can hear from doctors. I was certainly very influenced on the Protection of Life During Pregnancy when I heard from the masters of the maternity hospital who deliver tens of thousands of babies a year. But I think the point you're making, Mick, is before you put a question to the people and ask them to vote in a certain way, they're going to want to know what the world will look like post that referendum, and therefore I think the Oireachtas would be duty bound to show that before.
And that's why I think, Simon, the Minister's right about that, and that's why in Labour we published a bill in November to show what we want to see as a result of a repeal of the 8th Amendment, that the legislation we say we would replace a repeal of the 8th Amendment with. Now, I think the Dáil and Shannon are the appropriate places to have the debate that Mark talks about, the detailed debate about what goes into such legislation. But I do think we need to have repeal of the 8th Amendment first. I must say, in terms of the Citizens' Assembly, I was part of the Constitutional Convention process that led to the holding of the marriage equality referendum. I thought it was a very valuable process in terms of informing people. I thought in a similar vein, the Oireachtas Health Committee hearings on the protection of life during pregnancy bill were again very important and instructive. But I think what we need to see is this process being put in train quickly. I see some reports in the paper saying the Citizens' Assembly may now be brought forward as a result of this debate over Mick Wallace's bill, that we might see it commencing in September and that the time frame will be shorter than envisaged. I think my fear, and the fear of many of us who've been fighting for repeal of the 8th for a long time, is that this matter will simply be kicked down the road, that the Citizens' Assembly is some way just to delay the government having to do anything on this, and I think that would be utterly wrong. I think we need to see a referendum on this issue in 2017.
We have a Citizens' Assembly. It's called the Oireachtas.
It is, but in relation to this issue, the Oireachtas, and the point I made on Thursday, the Oireachtas cannot change and address the issues that Ivana would like to see addressed, and a lot of people would see, like, it can't make the change that I would like to see in relation to women experiencing fatal fetal abnormalities. That does require constitutional change, and we've been having this debate in this country for quite a long period of time, and bills come up time and time again in the Dáil, well-intentioned bills, and the answer, whoever's in my seat, is always the same. Whether they'd like to do it or wouldn't like to do it, they find themselves not able to do it because of the 8th Amendment. But I can confirm, though, that the government's intention now is to see the Citizens' Assembly commence before November.
September is the date that's being thrown out.
Yeah, we're hoping to have it commenced as quickly as possible in the autumn. The Cabinet has obviously approved the structure for it. We now need to amend legislation to allow the citizens to be selected from the electoral register, and we need to appoint a chairperson, and I think the appropriate chairperson is going to be really important. That needs to be a very strong individual who can facilitate debate, and then we need to put an expert panel in place so that people can hear from the experts and help them make informed decisions. But I can confirm that the Citizens' Assembly will commence in the autumn and will commence earlier than planned in November.
Will the time frame be shorter than...
Well, the time frame at the moment is 12 months for all of its work, and it's again, this point is sometimes lost.
Will the government survive that?
But again,
well, we hope so. Mick, Fine Gael up 4 points today.
That doesn't give much time for a referendum.
But no, let me just clarify, because it's a little bit of confusion. The Citizens' Assembly is looking at a range of issues. The 8th Amendment is one, and the 8th Amendment will be the first issue. It has to do all of its work within 12 months, but has the mechanism to report as it looks at each issue. So I would expect, and I would hope, that as it looks at each issue, that it would report back to the Oireachtas.
And this issue is the first issue on its agenda?
Yes, the Taoiseach decided after the Amanda Mellitt situation with the United Nations that it was appropriate that the first issue that the Citizens' Assembly would look at would be the 8th Amendment. So you're suggesting that perhaps if it's 12 months for its total agenda, you're saying within months of it being assembled in September, we'll say for argument's sake, that they could come back with a result for the Oireachtas, and then leaves it up to the Oireachtas to bring forward legislation for a referendum. Yeah, it's not for me to be too instructive to the Citizens' Assembly, but that's absolutely my understanding and my hope, that as they look at each issue, and this is the way the Constitutional Convention did it too, as they look at each issue, they can report on each issue, then send it to the appropriate Oireachtas committee or a special Oireachtas committee to debate and discuss it, and proceed.
Which, of course, is presuming that the Citizens' Assembly comes through with a clear recommendation.
Well, precisely, Mark, because for example, this shows the type of debate we can expect. We've a text in here. How can there be a debate in the Dáil when there's only one side being heard? No mention of Every Life Counts, which is an organisation, I think, that is against repeal of the 8th Amendment on the basis of fatal fetal abnormality, and parents being pressurised to travel, as it says here.
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be the problem, and there's no real way of resolving that issue. Well, and in fact, there would have been more political merit in the Independent Alliance keeping the feet to the fire of the government as a whole, to be seen to be the ones who are pushing this issue, even if everybody else agrees with it, but politically to be seen to be the ones who are carrying this ball forward, rather than going down the cul-de-sac that we appear to be going down this week, which will do nothing other than damage the ability and the reputation of the government to look like it knows what it's doing.
Well, I don't think it's a cul-de-sac if it does in fact lead to a shorter time frame, a tighter time frame, and clear terms of reference, and for the Citizens' Assembly, you know,
that's my point. Well, that they could be seen as being the spear carrier for that argument.
Well, that may well be how it turns out this week, particularly if there are commitments given in the Dáil this week in terms of the time frame and and specifically the terms of reference for the Citizens' Assembly, because one of the strengths of the Constitutional Convention was the very clear questions that we were asked to decide on, which meant that the messages we gave were more likely to be clear for the Oireachtas.
Yeah, there's another reality too, Minister, and that is, I mean, this is the first test to some extent of the cohesiveness of the government. Some people are suggesting that the government's term, certainly over the next 2 or 3 years, could be dominated by this issue. Yet there's not one mention of it within the programme for government.
Well, the programme for government does talk about establishing a citizens' assembly, and one of the issues it would look at is the 8th Amendment, and I'm very clear, based on the legal and medical advice available to me, that the issue of fatal fetal abnormalities falls within the debate about the 8th Amendment. There's also a commitment in the programme for government that ministers and ministers of state will vote together on private members' bills. So the programme for government is quite instructive in that regard.
Well, we're seeing now that's that.
But we need to be careful. I mean, this is like phrases like new politics get bandied about quite a lot. This is new politics. The government is this is very different to anything we've ever done before. Even when Ivana talks about legislation in terms of reference, and is quite right to, let's remember, it won't be the government that will have a majority to decide on any legislation. So this is going to really be a very inclusive process in terms of the
insisting that there is no free vote on a matter of conscience. Is the Taoiseach handling this in the most appropriate way for so-called new politics?
Well, you see, it's very easy, and I'm not suggesting any of my colleagues are doing this, but it's very easy to wrap yourself in the mantle of conscience. And what is conscience? My conscience certainly wouldn't allow me vote for a piece of legislation that the Attorney General, the Chief Medical Officer and Masters of Maternity Hospitals has told me won't make any difference whatsoever to the suffering that women are experiencing in this country. Go home to that night to bed saying, "Am I great? I did something positive," knowing in my heart that I haven't, knowing in my head that I haven't. So what is conscience? You know,
that's the central weakness in the point. If there was at least a debatable argument as to whether this would change something, then the position as adopted by Shane Ross and everyone would make perfect sense, but it doesn't.
And that's why I'm saying it's a red herring in terms of the independent alliance, this issue of conscience. And the other thing I think, which is a bigger thing, is, you know, what annoys me, I suppose, and many women who've been campaigning on this issue for so long, is that this is somehow different to everything else as a matter of conscience. People always vote with their conscience. I mean, conscience vote, you know, to allow a principle of free vote for particular issues, I think is problematic in a situation where there can be very extreme lobbying, and certainly, like many pro-choice politicians, I've been subjected to terrible abuse.
Ivana, just an example, another text within the problem with fatal fetal abnormalities is it is the thin end of the wedge. We cannot trust pro-abortion advocates, that's the phrase that's used, like Ivana, not to use it as a stepping stone to widespread access to and promotion of abortion as the preferred lifestyle choice of women.
That sort of language, I have to say, I have been subjected all my adult life, since I've been threatened with jail on this issue in 89 by SPUC, by the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child. I have campaigned on this all my adult life. I don't want my young daughters having to campaign on this issue too. I want to see this matter resolved in a sensible, compassionate way, in line with our colleagues in Britain and elsewhere. But I would say this, you know, the horrible abuse that I was subjected to, for example, on the floor of the Shannon, not just me, others who defended the 2013 bill as the best we could do at the time, subjected to terrible abuse, being called things like pro-abortion was light, believe me. So, you know, that's the sort of language we're up against. And that's why, can I just say this, on the free vote, people, particularly in Fine Gael at the time, I remember, were subjected to dreadful abuse, people in Labour and so on. And there was really, really heavy pressure brought to bear on many TDs and senators just on that bill, which, as we know, was extremely restrictive and only allows for abortion in termination of pregnancy where the woman's life is under threat by the pregnancy. So, you know, that's the sort of pressure people are under. I think there's the free vote issue. Why allow it just for this?
Okay.
It's a red herring in this context. The Independent Alliance have been told this bill is unconstitutional. They should be focusing on the real issue, which is getting movement on the need to repeal the 8th Amendment.
Okay, and on that note, we're going to go to a quick break and we'll be back with you in a minute.
The Sunday Show, Day Show, on Newstalk 106 to 108.
You're very welcome back. Mick Clifford here on The Sunday Show, and my panel, Minister for Health Simon Harris, news editor with the Irish Times Mark Hennessy, and Labour Party Senator Ivana Bacik. Ivana, Console, the charity, has been in the news for 10 days now, and I mean, what is coming out is people in terms of the misuse of funds. But in Business this morning, Colin Murphy has a very interesting column about these, and we have hundreds if not thousands of charities in the country, and we should have it all.
Yes, I thought it was very interesting to give an overall context, because as you say, Mick, the Console story has really been running and isn't going anywhere. I'm shocked at the extraordinary revenue about apparent abuse of funds and lavish lifestyles and so on, and the extraordinary Walter Mitty figure behind it all. But the piece by Colin Murphy just gives a sort of thoughtful perspective on it. He suggests that in Ireland for far too long we've allowed charities to fill the gap left by the state, that the state in fact has enabled the growth or the proliferation of these many, many charities, often duplicating the work of others. He says, he starts by saying the language in the Brexit debate in Britain was all about protecting our NHS, our National Health Service. Yeah. And he says, contrast that in Ireland. The idea that anyone here would stand up, any politician or anyone else would stand up and defend our HSE. He says the view in Ireland Ireland, or the public perception of state institutions is so different. We lack trust in state institutions. We've allowed the voluntary sector to fill that gap. I think it's a fascinating angle. I think he's quite right that the Church, and the Catholic Church in particular, sort of filled a gap through its voluntary agencies, and now we see, the NGO sector and so on, really being subcontracted by the state in many cases to provide services. We all know the terrible abuse that happened in industrial schools, and really that's a sort of an older example of that, where the state was simply paying religious orders to run homes for children who were destitute or who the state didn't provide for. And in the same way now, I suppose, the danger is that we're still subcontracting out work, for example, on suicide prevention to charities. Now, Colin Murphy rightly makes the point that most charities, of course, are run by people with enormous integrity,
Absolutely.
who do a huge amount of work often on a completely voluntary basis, and that shouldn't be overlooked in this debate. But nonetheless, the state has failed to regulate, to ensure that there aren't abuses, and we're still seeing very light touch regulation. I mean, it's well known the Charities Act passed in 2009, never fully commenced, and therefore we haven't seen the sort of level of regulation that one should have if one does have a whole range of charities.
Yeah, I mean, Mark, this attitude to the state and its institutions is post-colonial, you could well say, but it's about time we were getting over this kind of post-colonialism, isn't it?
It is, but I don't see any sign of that happening anytime soon. I mean, the reality on foot of what we've seen so far in Console is that anybody else who's involved in a charity behaving decently, trying to run a good shop, must be tearing their hair out.
Yeah.
They've come through the Central Remedial Clinic, they've had other scandals, all of which damaged their ability to, even though they weren't connected with any of this, it damaged their ability to raise cash. The general sense we've had in the last 6 or 8 months is that most of them thought they were beginning to come through that veil of tears, and now they're hit by this particular one. And we still don't have a full regulation. Part 4 of the Charities Act hasn't been enabled, so the Charities Regulator doesn't have the power to go in. And it's the usual story about a lack of transparency and a lack of accountability. And the basic motif or rule that we have is, I won't make you accountable on the days when you muck up, and you'll have the good manners not to do it to me when it's in reverse.
We're 3 years on from the CRC.
Yeah.
There was issues over rehab, the whole thing, and yet this still went on and only emerges now.
Well, I mean, bear in mind, there's one curious point. I remember, in my previous posting in London, watching Console and its operations there, and I remember a story that they put on at one point about the vast numbers of Irish immigrants who were in danger of committing suicide because they were in such dreadful straits living in London, which was not backed up, it has to be said, by any great level of facts and figures. And you had the UK charity regulator that for 2 years in a row qualified their accounts.
And yet that was reported here.
It wasn't reported here, and it wasn't acted on.
And now I see the Department of Foreign Affairs are going to inspect the accounts of the UK arm of the Console charity.
And the very act of qualification by the UK's charity regulator would have made Console UK ineligible for any state funding from the UK side.
And yet
so
they got
a media issue there as well. If we didn't report,
they got about 150,000 in funding from the Irish state in that short time.
I think a little more.
And Simon Harris, the other issue is this was first brought to the attention of the HSE in 2009, 7 years ago.
Yeah,
and yet they actually increased funding since then.
I can kind of see this from the two perspectives, because I was on the Public Accounts Committee at the time of the CRC and the likes, and like a lot of citizens was appalled at what was happening in a very small number of places, but and as Mark rightly says, the very negative impact that then had on other charities trying to go about their business. I do think it is important though to say that things have changed. Now, you can argue if they've changed fast enough, but if you look at where we are now post 2009, in 2009 we didn't have a charities regulator. You're correct, the charities regulator is only kind of getting up and running. There's 12,500 charities in Ireland.
That speaks for itself.
It does speak for itself, and I think there's a significant body of work that needs to be done in terms of mergers, and people set up charities well-intentioned locally. I was involved in one of my own community. People see a need and they try to fill that need, but is there duplication? Absolutely. You can't, just because somebody sets something up with the heart, it still has to be run by the head. There has to be controls. Now, the good news is Part 4 of the Charities Act, which does give the regulator the power, will be commenced on the 1st of September. So a massive body of work had to be done in literally identifying charities, listing charities, getting them registered. That's largely done now. The next piece now is the regulation piece, giving it the full regulatory functions. But in my role, I requested from the HSC on Friday a copy of the internal audit report. And I've been reading it over the weekend, and I'm just repulsed and appalled. And I think there needs to not be confusion here. What does the HSE do here? Well, the HSE effectively, in relation to Console, procures a service. The HSE basically says we need some bereavement counselling, we need a helpline, and we are paying you to provide that.
Provides huge funding for that.
Huge funding, but I must make the point, as it's important to those who work in Console, there's no question whatsoever about the service. So did we get value for what we purchased, if you like? Probably yes. That's not the issue though. The broader issue is the governance, the culture, the lavish lifestyles, which actually goes beyond the state's link, if you like, but does go into the broader charity sphere and the confidence that we can have in the sector.
Yeah, but you say beyond the state's link, but what about that issue of, as you said, 12,000 charities, there may well be mergers. Why not the state taking up the slack here, and at a time when the state is trying to hive off all sorts of things, the notion that it might actually come around to the point of view that this is work that the state should be doing as opposed to being left to the voluntary sector?
Well, I think the state does do it, but I think we'd be living in some sort of fantasy land to suggest that there'd never be a role for the voluntary sector.
12,000 charities,
there clearly doesn't need to be 12,000 charities, but there will always be a role for the charities.
What people will find extraordinary is the fact that this organisation was under investigation by the HSE for some time. This internal audit was going on, and yet the funding continued without it seems any sort of qualifications to what it was spent on. I mean, I accept what the Minister's saying about the service provided. I think that's come out very clearly, and that the councillors themselves were doing the best they could, often without being paid or being paid late. But the point is that surely the HSE could have at least required some controls on that spend when they were funding the organisation.
Just to tell you something that I don't think is known at this stage. I mean, the HSE did report its concerns to the Gardaí from a fraud perspective in February of this year. So there have been there has been a linkage. We shouldn't confuse the two issues. So you have internal audit has to follow very fair rules, and whether they frustrate us as they frustrate me, there's a process that needs to be gone through. Go in, forensically look at the accounts, give the person who you've audited the chance to respond. That process concluded last Friday, as in last Friday week. I've received a copy of the report earlier than would be normal because of the public interest here. I've requested it. But back as far as February, the HSE did report their concerns to the Gardaí, and there has been a Garda investigation ongoing and is still ongoing.
Since February?
Yes. But our job and my priority has to be, and had to be during that process, the continuation of the service. So what we've been trying to do now is to make sure that we can continue to provide the service to vulnerable people who need it, and also if Console can't, and I hope it can, but if it can't continue to provide the service, that there's no breakdown in service, that there's alternative service providers.
Since reporting to the Gardaí, was funding still given to Console? Understandably on one level, because you have to provide a service, but I mean, what checks and balances were put in?
I think one would expect conditions.
But I think this is where we can't get confused. I mean, the HSE has a link with Console, like it has with many organisations, that it grant aids it to provide a service. That service was provided very well and satisfactory, and I'm satisfied as Minister for Health that service was provided well, and that value was achieved in terms of the procuring of that service. What the HSE had concerns about was all of the other issues, which are appalling and repulsive, that we're reading about, and those were the issues that were reported to the Gardaí.
But how can the HSE be sure that if they continued funding, that funding would go precisely to the service? We've seen, for example, stories about councillors who haven't been paid by Console even in the last 6 or 7 months.
I need to be careful what I say in terms of due process, but I am confident that the HSE did successfully procure the services that were funded. What I'm appalled and disgusted about is to hear the ideas of deceased people's names being used on credit cards and really, really lavish lifestyles, and clearly people running an organisation that really should have never been within a million miles of an organisation with public funds.
Especially given the history that we're now reading about.
Yes.
Mark, the other issue is, I mean, I think it was Mairead McGuinness, the MEP. Now, she was formerly a journalist. She was involved in a story, I think she said on Friday, she was talking about it with a researcher in RT. They did a broadcast, I'm not sure it was a radio or TV, a story about this individual back in 1990 and his involvement in an organisation posing as some form of Christian charity. Like, to a certain extent, there's an element of this guy was able to continue in full glare of publicity despite having appeared in the district court for impersonating a doctor.
Yeah. We've been here before, though. This is the cult of personality, in a way, in which somebody has the ability to walk into the room and bend other people to his or her will. You know, we've all seen that in our lives. And then you look back afterwards when something goes wrong and you wonder why anybody stood aside and allowed it to happen. So, and by the nature of the charity sector, they're going to be more at risk of that, because you get somebody who has a personal tragedy in life, who on the back of it sets up a charity, who drives through fundamental change, probably does quite a few decent things along the way, but by the very nature of the beast are running their own empire, and they are instinctively unwilling and unable to accept any interference from the outside.
Yeah, well, again, it just points to the need for better regulation and better supervision by the state, which I think was the point in Colin Murphy's article. But I suppose, just to come back again, it does seem extraordinary that an organisation which is under this level of scrutiny, whistles having been blown, and the HSE and guards, indeed, as we now know, having been made aware that there still doesn't appear to have been any conditions placed on the funding. Now, obviously, more, no doubt, will come out on this, but normally the procedure would be in an organisation like this that somebody would be suspended under this sort of investigation while the service is allowed to continue. Of course,
we get around a lot of those kind of problems by some of the rules that are used in the UK, which allow for a particular clear presentation of a charity's accounts that are comparable one with the other. Everybody can be compared, and you have a greater chance in a situation like that of finding problems.
Very, very briefly, I mean, I think you're right, and I think when the charities regulator has its full regulatory functions from the 1st of September, that will address a lot of that. But the second point is, and it is an important point to make, that a lot of the information that we're now reading in the public domain and that we saw through the excellent work done by Primetime, we wouldn't know of were it not for the HSE's audit function. So these problems were detected and identified in great detail.
Arguably belatedly, but
perhaps so, but they were identified.
Just to make the point about charities, and this is another text we've got in. Mick, I work for the Ronald McDonald House Charity. Thank you for making the point. We are not all the same. We have a volunteer CEO. All our accounts are audited and published. We receive no state HSE funding, and we look after 20 families in Crumlin every night who have long-term sick children in Our Lady's Hospital. And I think that texter speaks for an awful lot of people working in the voluntary sector and the type of work they do and what they put into it themselves. And this is unfortunately one of the few but really shocking bad stories that has come to our attention. Okay, we'll be back in a minute just to discuss the fallout from Brexit.
The Sunday Show on Newstalk 106 to 108.
Okay, we're just turning to the continuing fallout from Brexit. Mark Hennessy, Shane Ross has a column in the Sunday Independent today basically saying in 5 years' time we'll look back and wonder what all the big deal was about. David McWilliamson, a similar theme, has been suggesting that we perhaps are overreacting to the negative aspect of this. You of course, you spent time as London correspondent for a number of years as well.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't agree with either of those arguments. I mean, what the British have done is historical in terms of its capacity to cause them damage. So many people in Britain regard themselves as being the beautiful princess who will be chased endlessly by the Prince Charming, i.e. in the form of the European Union, offering ever more demand. That there are contradictory demands here. What in fact is more likely to happen here is that the UK is the carrion on the ground, and people are now picking which bits of it. The French want to nail the city of London to a cross. The Germans, yes, fine, they've got trade interests in terms of cars and everything else. There will be competing interests here that will be contradictory. So the idea that they're going to get a clean free trade deal that will benefit them, there's no doubt that there is a future for the United Kingdom outside of the European Union. And yes, it could become the Singapore on the edge of Europe if it so decided to structure its society in that way. If that happens, that is going to ensure that the very people in Sunderland who voted for leave will be the first ones to be screwed to a wall. And this is the bit, you have people like Kwasi Kwarteng and others in the Leave group who want globalisation, who want deregulation on all fronts and all the rest of it. And if you look at what's coming out of India, for instance, India is looking at, they can't understand why the UK did what it did. Secondly, they were immensely frustrated by trying to agree a trade deal with the European Union for fairly legitimate reasons, because it's so complicated and messy, who now see an opportunity for a separate deal with the UK, and listen, fine, we can do this, not a problem. One of the things that they're going to be looking for is a mass increase in immigration from the subcontinent, particularly in terms of students. So the idea that that the British can get a trade deal that gives them all the nice bits, but doesn't give them the bits regarding immigration that so many of them so hate. And if you look at the problems that Britain has in terms of migrant workers, they are not the mistakes of the European Union, which is a flawed creature in 1,001 ways. I'm not defending it, but the point is, in terms of labour law, in terms of I remember doing a piece in Cambridgeshire a few years back with a town called Wisbech, and it's an hour outside Cambridge and a century behind, and really serious social problems. A third of its population are now post-04 arrivals. So in many ways, it's understandable that a town like that would be struggling with mass change in that regard. So there's no issue with that. But those people, first of all, came to do the agricultural picking jobs that the local British wouldn't do. They then migrated upwards to better but still poorly paid jobs in meat packing plants that some British would do, but the majority would not. They then did the same as the Irish did in Kilburn in the 50s. They lived 12 to a house. So you've got 3 or 4 houses on a street and everybody's upside. That's not because of Brussels. That's because Cambridgeshire County Council doesn't do its job in ensuring that houses and landlords are properly managed. Yeah. And you could go on and on and on and on and on in terms of the way in which education has been allowed to fall away, and the way in which, if you're an employer in Britain, you are more inclined to try and seek a young migrant workforce because of work ethic and all of the rest of it that you can't get from a local population.
Perception versus reality in terms of immigration. Minister, the thing that strikes a though, I mean, there's a piece in the Sunday Times today, I think it's quoting Marion Harkin making the point that, for example, if you go to the EU from an Irish perspective and you heard about Lithuania and there was an adjoining country and there was going to be an issue over the EU, we'd say, yeah, well, that's a pity and that's grand. There's no conception there of how huge, in terms of our economy, culture, the Northern Ireland, everything, this is to this country.
No, I think you're right, and that's been the Taoiseach and the Minister for Foreign Affairs' number one priority, and has to be all of our unified political objective, is outlining very clearly that yes, the EU and the UK have and will have a relationship, but Ireland and the UK have a very special and particular relationship. Now, the Taoiseach, when he came back from Brussels from the European Council earlier this week, had an opportunity to talk to people over there about it, and did feel there was a real understanding of that special relationship. And this is going to be our number one priority, making sure that issues in relation to cross-border Northern Ireland and the Republic, and issues in relation to trade, particularly keeping the common travel area. In my own department, there's a number of initiatives in the health area where we work with Northern Ireland. In fact, tomorrow I'll be meeting the Northern Ireland Minister for Health in Crumlin Hospital, and we'll be announcing a major new initiative to help children with heart problems in Northern Ireland gain surgery in Crumlin. These are all things we can continue to do, but there's now extra challenges in front of us, because if you have a Northern Ireland that's not in the European Union, how does the border work? And it's going to take time to tease all of these things out. But I suppose that is the message. There is time. People voted. They voted in a clear way. That vote has to be respected. But you vote for a Brexit doesn't happen straight away. It'll take at least 2 years and probably quite a bit longer.
Dan O'Brien in the Sunday Independent has suggested, well, he maintains that the Economic Management Council that we had in the last government was a very positive development from his perspective, but he has a very good suggestion. I think, should the government make a concerted effort to put together a Brexit Management Council, that they will be focused on the detail of what's going to unfold, because there's going to be a hell of a lot of detail, a thousand devils in every detail, according to one quote today.
It's interesting to hearing people yearn for the EMC when so many columns were written criticising the EMC. But I think the substantive point is fair. There needs to be there has been a lot of work done in terms of interdepartmental work in preparing for this, but to be quite frank, this is an evolving story until Britain triggers Article 50 to leave, until we see the terms on which Britain wants to leave, until we see the terms on which the EU wants to leave. The EU will obviously be putting its own kind of negotiators in place, and I do think it's important that the Irish voice is heard very clearly in that. Our Taoiseach is a member of the EPP, a very large political grouping. The Taoiseach also has a lot of experience in Europe, and as you rightly say, this country has a particular interest in the outcome of that, so we'll certainly be doubling our efforts on this.
Well, I think in all of this, clearly timing is crucial. I mean, we don't genuinely know what the outcome is, and it is interesting to see the divergence of views among commentators in the papers today. Some seeing it as much more positive, some even suggesting there might be a rethink of the Brexit referendum, but many others predicting dire results for Ireland and indeed for Britain and the EU as a consequence. We simply don't know, but I think the timing issue is critical in terms of when the actual departure happens. And of course, there was a huge difference of approach initially felt last Friday. I mean, I was watching Jean-Claude Juncker's immediate reaction where he said Britain needs to get out as soon as possible. Yeah. We need to trigger this. That really wasn't helpful in terms of trying to negotiate a path forward that will actually ensure the least adverse fallout. And from an Irish perspective, I thought the Taoiseach was right to distance himself from that sort of perspective and to say, and instead take a line that we need to take some time to consider the consequence. And I think it's very good to see actually Chancellor Merkel, her much more considered approach winning out, it appears, over Jean-Claude Juncker, where she's saying, no, Britain does need some time. And it now seems that Article 50 won't be triggered anytime soon. I mean, clearly we've got the huge political fallout in Britain, both from the Tories and of course Labour, and nobody's suggesting it's going to be triggered anytime before the autumn at the very earliest, when there's a new Tory leader in place.
Mark, Enda Kenny has a very delicate balancing act in terms of he wants to maintain a certain amount of loyalty with the UK on the basis of our relationship with them. At the same time, he can't alienate the big guns in the EU in doing so. It's going to be very delicate.
Well, it is, but it makes it all the more important that the negotiations start off from the right premise. We're making a mistake if we talk endlessly about the common travel area.
There's much more than
No. But if you look, but that's my point. The first line of debate in Ireland is about the common travel area and the border. We need to somehow present our argument that we are taking it for granted that none of that is changing, because otherwise we end up in a position where we're going to have to give away on some other grounds to protect on the common travel area and on the border. Now, that's an extremely difficult task for anybody to do. But if we go in all the time talking about that, at some point somebody is going to say to us on the other side of the table, well, what are you giving us in return?
Okay, unfortunately the clock has caught up with us at this stage, and that's it for the paper review. I'd like to thank very much the guests: Mark Hennessy, news editor of the Irish Times, Labour Senator Ivan Bacik, and the Minister for Health, Simon Harris. We'll be back in just a moment.